Opening the center grants immediate influence and a strong pawn presence. Developing the knight so early prepares for pawn expansion and potential central skirmishes. Seizing central space, c4 aims to restrict black's knight and prepare a queenside pawn thrust. A solid foundation for central control and knight development is laid, preparing for a pawn storm or a queenside expansion. Fortifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this solidifies white's central grip. Gambiting a tempo, black immediately challenges the central pawn structure and seeks to disrupt white's development with this forcing check. Developing the bishop and preparing to castle, this move maintains central influence while subtly reinforcing the queenside. Securing the queen's position, this maneuver prepares for potential castling by freeing the king's bishop and solidifying the central pawn structure. Bolstering the kingside's safety, this quiet maneuver prepares for fianchetto, reinforcing pawn coverage. Developing this knight asserts presence on the central squares, preparing for potential pawn thrusts and offering flexibility for future piece maneuvering. Developing the bishop opens a diagonal for potential queen pressure and solidifies the kingside structure. Trading the bishop simplifies the position, but black opens a diagonal for their rook and gains a tempo by forcing the queen to move. Recapturing the bishop solidifies the center and prepares for a central pawn push, controlling more space. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this move prepares for potential pawn breaks and aims to outmaneuver white's knight. Unlocking the center's potential, white boldly claims more space and prepares to activate the kingside pieces for an attack. Seeking to contest queenside space, black initiates a strategic pawn thrust that will soon challenge white's central pawn advances. Securing the king by castling allows white to connect rooks and prepare for central pawn advances while keeping the monarch safe. Bolder than usual, this thrust aggressively seeks to disrupt white's central control and seize initiative. Solidifying central control, white now aims to restrict black's queenside initiative and prepare for a kingside assault. The knight retreats, a curious sidestep, conceding central space to prepare for a potential d7 maneuver. Aggressively cracking open the queenside aims to exploit black's misplaced knight and gain a lasting advantage in space. Castling safely shelters the king, preparing to bring rooks into active play. Opening the c-file immediately challenges black's queenside structure and creates dynamic play. Clearing the central files, this pawn thrust opens avenues for both sides to assert influence, creating dynamic tension and potential tactical skirmishes. Unleashing a knight's unexpected journey to the rim, preparing for central dominance and potential queenside expansion. Central pawn pressure intensifies, the bishop now eyes the queenside. Pivoting the knight to c2 aims to reinforce the center and prepare for potential queenside expansion. Asserting control over the open c-file, this rook's deployment signifies an aggressive push into white's territory. Securing the queenside pawn structure prevents immediate knight infiltration and prepares for potential pawn breaks. A deliberate repositioning of the knight, aiming to bolster the queenside and potentially unlock the c-file after a future pawn push. This knight repositions to prepare for a central pawn push or to reinforce the queenside. The queen retreats, but this relinquishes central influence and allows white to build a formidable pawn chain. Reinforcing the e4 pawn while eyeing the f5 square, aiming to solidify the center and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Introducing a knight to the queenside, this maneuver aims to challenge white's central control and potentially initiate queenside play. Securing the king's flank is paramount, as the central pawn push has subtly altered the pawn structure. Bolstering the queenside's territorial claims, this pawn push aims to restrict white's knight and create a secure outpost on b3. Preparing a subtle kingside reinforcement, this redeployment aims to bolster the central pawn structure against any potential black incursions. Introducing a knight to the central outpost on c5 enhances piece activity and pressure along the queenside. Fortifying the center and preparing for a queenside expansion, This knight redeployment solidifies white's structure against black's ambitious pawn push. A daring knight sortie aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and claim vital central squares. Reinforcing the queenside advance, this rook maneuver aims to bolster the pawn chain and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Unlocking the queenside's potential, this rook pivots to create dynamic pressure along the fifth rank, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal eyes potential pawn breaks and supports the knight's foray. Solidifying the pawn structure, preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or central expansion, this maneuver intends to limit white's central influence. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield, preparing for potential peace maneuvers without immediate tactical urgency. Solidifying the king's security, this maneuver prepares for potential pawn breaks or even a safer haven from the looming queenside action. Shifting the bishop prepares to contest the c-file and potentially exploit the queenside pressure. Black reroutes the knight to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queenside while bolstering defensive resources. Unleashing a central pawn storm, white seeks to crack open lines and exploit the momentarily vulnerable black king. Fortifying the kingside structure against anticipated central advances, this solidifies black's defenses. Unlocking the f-file for potential pressure and preparing to support the central pawn advance. Navigating this knight to the robust outpost at b3, black aims to seize crucial squares and disrupt white's queenside initiative. Clearing the b3 square opens the diagonal for the bishop, potentially targeting weaknesses on black's queenside. Suddenly, black seizes the open file, creating immediate pressure against white's queenside structure. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm aggressively challenges black's kingside structure. Unlocking new attacking avenues on the queenside, this pawn push aggressively challenges white's spatial advantage and opens lines for black's pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, challenging the monarch's safety. Initiating a bold rook infiltration, aiming to exploit the open files and pressure white's weakened king. Opening the f-file here is a tactical gamble, creating immediate threats against black's king. Opening the kingside files is a double-edged sword. Prepare for immediate tactical skirmishes. Unlocking the kingside is the objective here, aiming to expose the enemy monarch with the advanced pawn. Unleashing the g-pawn opens new attacking avenues, but exposes your king to immediate counterplay along the now open file. Realigning the knight to a more active square prepares to contest the kingside or reinforce the central d-pawn. Initiating a pawn break on the queenside aims to unravel white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Opening the file offers a dynamic avenue for your rook, but be wary of overextending. Challenging white's queenside structure, this pawn thrust opens lines and aims to exploit potential weaknesses further up the board. Unleashing a knight to hunt the black king, exploiting the pawn shield's fragility. Defensively repositioning the king to a potentially safer square, though the open files still pose a threat. The knight repositions, seeking a better outpost and anticipating pawn breakthroughs. Opens the door for attacking threats on white's weakened king, exploiting the b-file's newfound activity. Opening the b-file is a calculated risk, aiming to disrupt black's queenside while creating dynamic play. Bypassing the immediate pawn thrust, black opts to regroup the rook, potentially preparing a counterplay along the 7th rank or to support future pawn advances. The pawn storm on the kingside finally ignites, a desperate attempt to pry open the enemy stronghold. Initiating a desperate fight for the open h-file, black offers the c-file to white's powerful rook. Seizing the open file promises active counterplay, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Capturing the rook clears the file, potentially opening avenues for further exchanges or pawn pushes. Unlocking the king's diagonal with the rook's redeployment offers an attack on black's exposed monarch. Activating the bishop to b5 creates diagonal pressure and eyes potential tactics on the queen side. securing the important open file for future operations. The rook now eyes the pawn, creating a potential weakness for white's queenside pawn structure. The knight advances, seeking to exploit the compromised kingside and pressure black's defenses. Asserting the bishop's influence on the long diagonal creates a crucial outposting opportunity, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. Challenging the exposed black king with a sudden knight maneuver. A subtle repositioning to bolster the kingside, aiming to tie down white's pawns. Repositioning the knight aims to contest the open h file and support a potential kingside attack. The bishop retreats, anticipating threats, but sacrifices valuable tempo in a tense, locked position. Unlocking a diagonal and exposing the king's retreat path creates immediate tactical problems for black. A fleeting check is evaded, allowing the king to retreat and consolidate defensive lines against the encroaching queenside pressure. Unleashing a potent diagonal threat, the queen swarms the exposed black monarch. Seeking to consolidate defensive lines and prepare for the looming queenside pressure. Aggressively seizing the open file, this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and create immediate pressure. Seeking to break the pin and activate the queen, though it might overextend. Exchanging queens now simplifies the position considerably and aims to exploit your superior piece activity. The exchange on the f-file initiates a queenless middle game where pawn breaks will become paramount for creating attacking chances. Finally, the rook asserts dominion over the open file, aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to the open file initiates a plan to harass the white rook and potentially create passed pawns. The rook's repositioning aims to exploit the open file and pressure the opponent's isolated pieces. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing weaknesses on white's queenside. Opening the h-file to expose the king, a daring attempt to create chaos. Seeking respite from the relentless queenside pressure, the black king retreats to a more sheltered square, hoping to avoid further complications. Exploring open files for activity often reignites the attack. Sacrificing the bishop on f5 opens the g-file, creating an aggressive pawn push opportunity for white. This exchange simplifies to an endgame where white's active pieces can exploit black's weakened pawn structure. Activating the knight to a more central, aggressive post. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank seizes a crucial outpost, threatening to infiltrate the black defenses. The king bravely steps into the open, seeking shelter as the final pawns clash. Activating the king is paramount, as the pawns on the kingside have been stripped away. Opening a diagonal for the bishop with the knight's sacrifice presents an interesting tactical puzzle. Initiating an attack on the king's vulnerable shelter with a decisive check. The king's flight path is abruptly cut off, leaving it exposed to the oncoming storm. This capture reactivates the rook and targets the advanced pawn, seeking to dismantle black's queenside structure. Committing the knight to this outpost offers no immediate threat and sacrifices tempo, surrendering the initiative. Securing the pawn on d5 with the king opens up lines and prepares to centralize the monarch. Bolstering the king's defense, this pawn advance creates a vital shield. Centralizing the king to support the queenside pawns offers a more active role in this simplified position. Injecting a touch of dynamism, this pawn advance aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially open new avenues. The monarch ventures towards the center, seeking to activate its dormant power amidst the approaching material exchange. A cautious retreat, seemingly relinquishing the initiative to regroup the monarch. The king's march begins, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame. Embracing the outpost, this pawn now stares down the enemy's weakened king. Shifting the king towards the center consolidates the remaining pawns for a potential endgame surge. The king's escape to g8 offers a temporary refuge, preparing to support the advance of the e-pawn. The king's slow shuffle towards the center signals a deliberate endgame transition, aiming for safety and central influence. The king retreats to a safer square, avoiding the pawn's advance and preparing to regroup. The king's escape route is blocked, leaving it exposed to a swift mating net.